How do you tell a good story? That's something I've been working on for the past 14 years, working as an interpreter, a translator, and a coordinator at 3 different international human rights conferences. Now, that sounds very impressive, but it also means that I'm not usually standing in front of an audience on a podium, but my work is immortalized in pictures such as these. Can you find me? I'm the only woman behind all the men. Or more often, I'm not in the frame at all. Here, I'm interpreting for a 1-week-long meeting between a Korean adoptee living in the Netherlands and her birth family who have not seen each other for 37 years. So through my experiences, I've been privileged to meet some of the most inspiring people around the world: human rights activists, artists, journalists, policymakers, politicians, working on making the world a better place. I'm going to share with you just a few of the stories because if I would continue, it would take maybe 10 years. There are stories of perseverance, like the story of Ito Shiori. Shiori is a Japanese journalist and filmmaker who became the face of the Me Too movement in Japan after she herself was sexually assaulted by her former boss, well, her then boss. She tried to go to the press, which she was working for in 2015, who told her that this man was a very powerful man and they didn't want to pursue the story. She went to hospitals who didn't have rape kits. The police told her that she would ruin her career, and she began a long legal battle which she won 5 years later in 2020 when she managed to win a civil lawsuit after going to 3 different courts in Japan, including the Supreme Court of Japan. 2 years later, I met her on a panel where she said, I've had a really long battle, but today I won my 2nd lawsuit. So I'm going to drink some wine, go to the hot springs, and hang out with my cats. Then there's stories of defiance, like that of Leila Hedari, who is an Afghan woman who was a child bride who managed to divorce her husband in Afghanistan and then started Kabul's only privately run drug rehabilitation center. But in 2021, in August, when the Taliban took over Kabul, the organization I was working at, managed to privately fund the van to smuggle her out of Kabul into safety in Pakistan. After haggling with her for several hours, the van had to leave because she said, "I'm not going to leave my country when there's people who still need my help." Last I checked, she's still running a school in hiding for Afghan girls and women. Then there's stories of resilience, like that of Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, who is the opposition leader of Belarus in exile. When the conference I was working at managed to catch her for 30 minutes between running from, I think, the European Parliament to meeting the president of Poland, she sat down in a hotel room. And when we asked her what she would tell other activists who are also working on changing the world, she said, with a frankness that you don't often see from politicians, "Sometimes I'm exhausted. I just want to live an ordinary life. But then I think about the people who have given up their freedoms, their lives, so we can continue fighting. And I will ask for help from people who still have more fight in them and share that I am struggling. And that's what you should be doing." Now, she is saying that as the person who ran for political office as the president after her husband was imprisoned for doing the exact same thing, and she had to flee the country with her 2 children, not knowing when she would ever, if ever, see her husband again. When hearing those good stories, usually you remember 3 different things. The who, the person, you remember their face or what they look like, the facial expression they have. The how, the journey of how they got to that story, of how they began their journey, or are still continuing. And the why, of why they are driven to, despite so many personal challenges, continue fighting this fight. It can also be accompanied by a call to action, which means they're trying to tell you to take action, to change your way of thinking, or to support them. Now, it is relatively easy to get to know how to be a good storyteller. And I can tell you that as somebody who used to have crippling stage anxiety. And there are so many TED Talks who will tell you how to become a better storyteller. But once you become good at telling your own story, you have to return to a more fundamental question, that of why you are telling the story. Is the story that you're going to tell benefit you as a person, the listener, the greater good? Is it going to harm somebody, or will it protect somebody, and will it empower somebody? These are questions that I've had the chance to ponder through my work. I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a super smart person who likes to think about things all day. And these are thoughts I had when I was working at my job as an interpreter for Seong-Yu, who is an amazing human, but he's a North Korean defector and one of 3 North Korean refugees to be elected into South Korean parliament. I met him when I was working as an interpreter for him 3 days in 2016 and in 2018 in Oslo, when he was speaking about his story, which I know is guaranteed to make you cry. When he was 13 years old, he was smuggling coal across the border from North Korea to China as a child. He was 13 on a train. And because he was chronically malnourished, he fainted and fell off the train. And what happened was that there was a train running right behind it, which ran over his arm and his leg. And after this incident happened, of course, he had to go to the hospital. But remember, this is North Korea. There's no anesthesia, there are no scalpels, and there are no antibiotics. And he managed to survive this. And he escaped North Korea eventually because of the discrimination that he would face as a disabled person. But during my time, I noticed that all of the first day was spent talking to journalists who would ask the same questions to this man, asking him to recount his tales of trauma. Was it in 2003 or 2004 that you had this accident, or was that when you escaped North Korea? And by the second day, I looked at him and he looked at me, and we kind of decided I had enough notes from the first 10 interviews. And he didn't enjoy Oslo because he had never been there before. So we decided that I would just tell his story on his behalf, and he would just trust me to do that. So sometimes it can be beneficial for people not to tell their story. I also think about the time that I met a South Korean adoptee in Seoul who had met her birth family, and she was asking them the question that most adoptees want to ask, which is, why did you give me up for adoption? Why did you send me away like the 160,000 children who were exported out of South Korea? And they would not give her an answer. They would tell her different answers each time, or they would dodge the question. And I knew the answer as somebody who had grown up in South Korea, which was that she was given up because she was a girl, because girls were undesirable in a South Korean family. And that was a story I chose not to tell her, because I did not know her well enough to be able to gauge whether it was something that she wanted to attach to her pre-existing trauma. Now you think, I've been working on the how of telling a story and the why of telling a story, so I must be a very good storyteller when it comes to my own. But that's not really the case. Although people might disagree when you saw my face on the front page of a Dutch newspaper in March 2020, talking about anti-Asian hatred that began to spike in the Netherlands and Europe in general with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. When this article was published, I even got a phone call from an ex saying, "Congratulations, you're famous! You should go on TV and radio and become the queen of racism." So that was... and the survey that I created after I narrowly escaped physical assault for being Asian received 300 responses within the first 2 weeks. And we followed it up with a second survey made by actual researchers, so not me, with 1,200 responses. And we became the first Asian organization to be consulted by the European Commission on their anti-racism action plans. But what you see on this photo is not all of the story, because it's just one person, which is me, and obviously I cannot encompass the stories of all the Asians living in the Netherlands or in Europe or even in The Hague or even on my street. because they're stories that were not included in the survey or in the newspaper articles. The day this article was published, I actually got a phone call from a woman, an Asian woman who remains anonymous by choice. And she asked me, "You wrote about an accident that happened to me and you wrote it without my permission. I would like to know where you heard about it." Okay, well, I wrote a form that asked for consent and people would only share stories that they wanted to, so I was wondering what was happening. But I had written about an incident where an Asian family found their house graffitied with white supremacist signs in March. And she told me that is exactly what happened to my family, except that it happened inside the corridor of our apartment building. I told her, well, this was about a house, not an apartment. And it turned out there were two different incidents. But obviously, she did not want her story publicized because she shared this corridor with one other family who would be able to retaliate against her and her family and also her children if they had found out. There's also stories of Asian women. I particularly remember stories from Japanese and Indonesian women who said they had moved to the Netherlands either as a student or after falling in love with a Dutch person on a holiday, which quickly turned into an abusive relationship, but which they could not leave because they wanted to stay in this country because they had started their lives there, or because their lives were not as good back home. And these were stories that we cannot include in public because they would be deported by the IND. And then there's stories that cannot be shared anymore because the people behind them don't exist anymore. And for the last story, I'm going to share with you the story of Angel. Angel was a transgender woman from Macau who moved to the Netherlands after her family subjected her to conversion therapy in China. And she stayed in an AZC in the Netherlands until in 2021, she was sexually assaulted by other people in the refugee center. And she spent what she could of her life trying to share this story. She contacted the AZC, the refugee center. She contacted the COA, the Central Asylum Processing Center. And she tried to contact the press. But the difference between Marlon and I, we do share similarities because we're both from East Asia, we're both women, and we're both people who have left their country for their identity. But what she didn't have was, I've never met her, so I'm just going off of my head. I speak fluent English. I'm university educated. I work at a human rights organization, which makes it a very interesting profile for the media to write about. And I also have a network, which you probably didn't have sitting in a refugee center. And eventually, I only got to find about her story through a friend who was one of the last people she was able to reach out to, who works on the Chinese LGBT community in the Netherlands. But what you will see on the media is me, just one person. So next time you hear a good story that stays with you for days, for weeks, for months, or for years, I would like you to think about the fact that there are so many more stories that are untold, either voluntarily or involuntarily, because that's something I hope to keep doing.